get into it.
Let's get into it. So we'll just create space for you to just kind of share a little bit with us about who you are. Give us a snapshot. Who is Dr. Phil Roundtree?
Oh, right now. So we're rocking and
We are
rolling.
on. We are
if
on.
you may.
This I'm saying though, like this is the difficult part, right? Like I sent you send the bio to folk, and I mean you can lead us in too. Because it's real. Like you send a bio to folk, you used to going to different places and speaking, and but when folk ask you about yourself, it's just like, well, yeah, I don't really know. I'm just, I'm somebody who loves Black folk, right? I love education, no matter the platform, and I think that's vital when it comes to this idea of Black liberation, and then just liberation for all persons of the global majority who are negatively impacted by all these systems that exist. I think that really encompasses like who I am. You'll read the bio and it'll say all these things about degrees and the work that I do, which, the degrees, I really could care less. That means I could just go to school really well, but the people I care about, they don't necessarily care if I'm Dr. Phil or if I got 4 degrees. They don't really care about that. All that. It's just like, how are you going to help and aid community? So that's really, what the game is for me. So yeah, I leave that to other folk. When you send out the CV and all that stuff, they could read all that stuff. For me, it's just like, what are the folk in the community where I'm at, how they feel about me, and so they continue to accept me. So that's all that matters to me.
Honestly, we definitely have to leave that in because that was a great start.
I know, right?
Absolutely. Heck yeah.
Off the dome. Well, thank you so much. I love that. Very real, very raw. Well, in that case, we're going to get right into some questions that we have for you. We've had a chance to kind of review some of your work. And one of the things that stood out to me was this distinction that I heard you make between mental health and Black mental health. So wanted to know if you could expound on that. Like, how do you define Black mental health, and how is it different from what people might think of as just mental health?
Yeah, so I take it you watched the TEDx talk.
I did.
You did, yeah. That's one of those things, right? Where, and maybe this is where Kendrick and the Super Bowl and all this, maybe he on the same type time potentially. Like in hindsight, when it comes to that, like them folk ain't deserve that. You know what I'm saying? But I recognize that it did reach a lot of people. You know what I'm saying? But when you think about, I'm not making a dime off of that unless folk bring me in, and I've gotten a lot of speaking engagements from folk who've watched it, but ultimately they continue to profit off of it. And that's how capitalism works, right? I did the labor, I shared, my story, I shared my pain, I shared my triumphs. And I mean, yeah, there's some intrinsic reward that exists there. But ultimately in hindsight, I don't know if I would have did it again. You know what I'm saying? Just because I don't know if they deserve that, right? And again, when I say they, we're talking about, those who uphold these structures, which, despite good intentions that the folk at TED have, like, yeah, maybe you should be cutting folk into the profits of what they earn from their videos. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm sure y'all bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars. You have to be, right? And so
some of these TED Talks get shared so virally, right?
Yeah.
That like, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, I mean, some of them like are really important, right? And so I look at, when I watched the earlier ones like Simon Sinek, and I was just like, yo, he's dope. You know what I mean? Just in his ability to articulate various things. It was some other ones. It was a guy, an Asian guy, 100 Days of Rejection, and where he was going into like full-time entrepreneurship. His wife, his partner was like, listen, I'm gonna give you either like 6 months to a year to get things popping, right? Because we got this family happening, and you either gonna make it or I need you to get a real job. And so every day he did something to where he could potentially get rejected. So he doesn't necessarily have this fear of being out here in these entrepreneurial streets. So one of the things that he did was he went to Krispy Kremes, and he was just like, listen, can you make me a dozen, don't make me like 6 donuts, like 6 donuts in the style of the Olympic rings. And they was like, yeah, I got you. Right. But you know what I'm saying? And so it was things like that. And so he outlined that and how that type of rejection therapy helped him overcome some things, some insecurities he was navigating. So yeah, so there's definitely some positives that come from that. And so yeah, in that TED talk, I made the distinction between Black mental health and mental health as we know it. When we think about anything in this society, it's from a Eurocentric lens, right?
Yeah.
When we think about when they talk about the great actors of all time, you might get a Denzel thrown in there, you might get a Holly's Berries thrown, you know what I
Viola,
mean?
maybe.
You might get a a little Viola thrown in there, but you're not gonna get a James Earl, right? And he's and seeing some
Rest
of the
in
clips.
power.
For sure, right? And again, this goes to just the complexity of just people, because I've seen some of his comments about women, Black women specifically, and it's just like, oh damn, James, you know what I'm saying? But you're not going to hear him in those lists. You're not going to hear Vivica A. Fox, right? She Black famous. She's not.
That's true.
She's not their type of famous. So anything we talk about comes from this white supremacist lens. And so the same thing remains true when we talk about mental health. So when I talk about Black mental health, I'm talking about the unique psychological and emotional experiences that shape who we are, right? That impact how we show up. And we talk about things like systemic racism and trauma, both historical and present day. We're talking about just cultural factors that disproportionately impact Black folk, right? So when we talk about Roe v. Wade, who's most likely to be disproportionately impact? Black women, poor folk, right? And so then when we start talking about just, the things that we navigate, depression, anxiety, PTSD, the effects of stigma and untreated mental health conditions in general, right? These things fall under this umbrella of Black mental health. It's some of it is definitely unique to us, right? And then when we talk about just Eurocentric understanding of mental health, we look at things like the psychological Bible, which is the DSM, right? And everybody has to also, license folk, and that's another, again, these racist ass terms. Right? I don't know if I'm allowed to, use my French. But
you are allowed to use all the French.
Word. Well, when we look at things like the DSM and how folk who are licensed psychologists, psychiatrists, and mental health professionals, how they must use that in order to get paid ultimately, if they're working with an insurance company.
That's
right. And so with this, you have the godfather, the father of Eurocentric psychology, this boy named what's his name? Because it's a school named after him here in Philly. His name escapes me right now, right? But he's somebody who believed in things like drapetomania, who believed in things like negritude, right? And so we're talking about things like Black folk desire to be white.
Right.
So they break out with this leprosy type of, like, fam, what are we talking about? And this was included within this Eurocentric framework. You know what I'm saying? And so what it doesn't do is it doesn't account for the unique social and cultural factors that impact Black folk. It doesn't necessarily look at racial trauma and the need for just culturally competent care. Just now are they starting to get into, it needs to be anti-racist, right? After you know, after post George Floyd, it's just like anti-racist. But do people give a damn about, you know, cops killing black folk at this point? No, no, that's long gone. We saw that over the weekend with Tyreek Hill of the Dolphins, right? It's not even an outrage when it truly comes to this, you know. So and then when we just talk about things like just disparities in mental health treatment and outcomes and the impact of systemic oppression, it's just it's again, are not necessarily, everything isn't necessarily unique to black folk, but so much of it is, and we need to be mindful that when we're navigating our mental health under the auspices of white mental health, ultimately, we not going to necessarily get a fair shake when it comes to it. I think the statistic is like 2 to 3% of the country's mental health professionals, psychologists, and psychiatrists are black folks. So what does that mean? You're going to walk in 9 times out of 10, you're going to walk into a space where the person that's working with you not going to look like you,
right?
You know, and so that can be a barrier.
Yeah,
absolutely. What do you think I mean, I feel like I've definitely been in therapy spaces in which, like, you know, the person therapizing you does not look like you. But from your point of view, what do you think is like the the major problems with that? Because I'd love to hear it from you.
Yeah. So, and this is where, you know, we have this thing, and so, you know, to get into, I know I said, you know, forget these degrees and all of this, right? So in my dissertation, I used this framework from that was created by Dr. Carr out of Howard, and it's a Africana Studies conceptual framework, right? And so it has the social structure: who are black folk to white folk. Then it has this governance structure: who are black folk to one another. And so when we talk about going into a therapeutic environment and the person doesn't necessarily look like you, there's caution. There's just something, you know, physiologically that happens where it's just like, damn, I don't know if I can open up to you. It's not to say that they're a terrible therapist. They could, again, I've been with white folk, you know, I know white folk therapists who are quality, right? But then when we talk about just that initial interaction and what that can mean somebody, you know what, I'm just not going to open up. I don't care how good you might be. Yeah, I just don't feel that this environment is safe, just based on the complexion of your skin, which is a reality when we talk about the trauma that's been experienced by black folk.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And I think so much of what you spoke about, it just speaks to the fact that we do live in an anti-black, you know, society, and all of us are educators. But I have for a very long time felt that way as well about education, and our, you know, our black students needing something different than what they typically get, you know, in traditional education, which I think is what, obviously, you know, culturally responsive education, the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and so many others was birthed out of. So definitely fully agree as it relates to the Black mental health and the need for us to kind of make that distinction.
Yeah, yeah. And just to clarify, that don't mean every brother is a brother. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, not every skin folk is skin folk, for real.
Exactly. So, you know, but just that initial interaction. Now you want to make sure that they're qualified. You want to make sure that you feel safe in that environment, because you could feel unsafe no matter, you know, how they identify racially and ethnicity wise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I've had those experiences too.
And it's like hard to try to open up to someone who, when there's just like seems to be this gulf between you that it's hard to walk over, right? I've definitely had therapists that have been like, I don't really know how to approach you because you're Black, and like that's weird.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Well, hopefully they were honest about it. You know what I'm saying? That's all you can ask. You want people to speak their truth, right? Yeah, like, I'm not sure. Now, is it your responsibility to teach? That's a question, right? If we're talking about shared humanity, it's always our responsibility to teach our fellow human beings how we want to be treated and how we should be engaged. But then on the opposite end, yeah, you have to undertake that work yourself or as a community as well.
That's a really good point. I like that.
Yeah, I think we don't often get to talk about like what we owe each other as humans, you know, or like the idea that, yeah, sometimes we do have to teach each other things because that's what it is to be human. And then like also taking the moment to be like, is this what I need right now in my life, like in this moment?
Yeah. Yeah.
So as an advocate for systemic change towards liberation, especially for Black men and mental health in layman's terms, what are these systems and how have you personally experienced them and how do you demystify them in the work that you do?
All of them. You know what I'm saying? I think that's the safest way to say it. Like all of them, right? You know, to get more specific. So, you know, we look at healthcare, right? When I just rolled off that number, when we talk about mental health professionals, psychologists, and psychiatrists, that's a part of healthcare. And so when we talk about the lack of representation in these spaces that matter, they ain't believe Serena, right? And it's just like, well, if they not believing Serena, who
then what
has,
chance do I have?
you know, hundreds of billions of dollars,
right?
You know, any other old Negro, hey, good luck to you. You know what I'm saying? Good luck to you. Then we talk about things like law enforcement. I don't necessarily have to go in depth with that. You know, education, right? Like the educational system is freaking terrible.
Yeah,
I live in. Say it again.
Fraught.
Exactly. I live in Philadelphia, and I chuckle because it's asinine, man. I live in Philadelphia. The mayor has proposed, and it actually just started, all year schooling for students. Now you can opt in, right? It's something that you would have to opt into. And but we talking about schools that are decrepit, that still got asbestos in there. Right. We're talking about schools just 2 weeks ago. We had some 90-degree days. They're like, oh, yo, we gotta close this down at noon. You know what I'm saying? Because it's gonna be hot in here. So again, what does this mean for a community who the education system is, you know, historically racist and anti-Black? The teachers that inhabit these classrooms. I worked as a behavior specialist and a mobile therapist at some point, and I would be in these classrooms, and I'm like, "Oh, you shouldn't be in here, ma'am. This has nothing to do with Lil Hakeem. You know, this is about you. You just don't know how to engage them." But what happens, you go to these predominantly white institutions. I went to one, you know, I would put a middle finger up to Bloomsburg, but I'm trying to be nicer these days. But it's considered a teaching institution, right? And so you have these folk. It's a predominantly white institution, so predominantly white in these classrooms. When they do their practicums and such, it's within the surrounding community that's predominantly white. And then they may come back to affiliate. They may come back and they're not necessarily invested there. Why? Because, all right, let me do these couple years in the public school system so I can get out to the county, and then I can really start teaching. You know, so it's just like a place to hone my skills and say I'm doing all the things, right? I care, especially when we talk about like these white liberals, and we know that education and social work and just helping professions in general is dominated by white women. Yes. And so they go into these spaces. They even have a savior complex. I'm gonna save you Negroes. You know what I mean? Shout out to Jane Addams, you know, fresh out of Chicago. You know what I'm saying? One of them.
Yes.
But ultimately that ends up harming, because again, the lack of cultural understanding that exists. You know,
it's kind of like their training grounds. It makes me think about like programs like TFA, you know, Teach for America, and all these teacher prep programs where they do this 6-week, you know, training, and then they just immerse them into some of the more, you know, underserved communities. These are, again, people who have never really spent any time in these communities, and they're in and out. And the kids are, I mean, many of these individuals, even though they come from Ivy League, you know, institutions, have never had any experience working with young people. Their backgrounds are in fields that have nothing to do with education. They're literally just kind of doing their time. That's how they look at it.
Yeah, and it's like, how many of them have actually talked to people from these backgrounds before, right? Or like interacted with them in any kind of serious way that wasn't service or like white
Yeah.
saviorism, right?
But
And
it
so it's
just
like
feels like our
also,
kids are being
yeah,
experimented on. You know what I
it
mean?
yes, which
Yeah,
has been historically the case.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
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 And what happens, you know, when we talk about just mental health, and this touches on to the healthcare aspect, and it reminds me, right? Like when you go to these psychologists, you go to these psychiatrists, you know, ultimately what happens a lot of times is just reinforcing stigma, right?
That's right.
It's you end up with a lot of with things like misdiagnosis. So again,
Yeah.
personal experience when I was working as a therapist for an actual organization, we would have to go into the evals, right, and provide whatever information. And I was in there, and it was a young kid. He was maybe about he was about 6 or 7, right? He was living with his grandmother because his parents weren't capable. His grandmother and grandfather, God bless the ancestors, his grandfather is had passed away since then. And sitting in there, and it's just like, well, yeah, we're gonna give him conduct disorder. And I said, wait, whoa, time out.
Yeah.
Time out. What are we talking about here?
Yeah.
Right? Conduct disorder.
Yeah.
Um, you know, why couldn't it be depression? Why couldn't it be
Mm,
anxiety? Why does it have to be anything?
right.
Right? Why couldn't it be just navigating, you know, the world as a 6-year-old living with my
Ugh,
grandparents, and my
right?
parents are don't have necessarily the parenting skills to assist me. So when I'm in the classroom, I may be acting out because I don't have the language to articulate what it is that I'm feeling.
Yeah.
Mm,
I was trying. Then when we talk about healthcare and we talk about systems, you know, everybody laud Children's Hospital for being an amazing place, you know,
yeah.
for sick children, which it is. I'm not going to say that it's not, right? But I know in trying to get that grandmother an appointment to have her child evaluated for potentially what they consider autism, they ain't folk
Mhm.
never call back. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
We leaving message after message, months and months and months. They talk, or they're saying, listen, we could get to you in about 6 to 8 months. And it's
Yeah.
just like, oh, word. So everything can compound, and then it could be more of
And
an
get
issue.
much worse in that time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's the thing about mental health. Like it is kind of time sensitive. Like it will get worse
Hmm.
the longer it continues to progress without intervention.
for sure. And I think we, you know, we must laud ourselves as a community for doing, you know, what we got to do to get by. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? It's
That's
just, you
right. To
know,
survive.
rest in peace, you know, rich homie Quan, you know,
Yeah.
who allegedly died from an overdose. Right. We know what that looks like. I know what that looks like in my family with my brother. I don't know what he was navigating. I don't know
Mhm.
how he dealt with the pressures and stresses of what it means to be a black man in society. If he would have went to a therapist, or would they say he's depressed, or would they say he has bipolar disorder, which is the flavor of du jour for black men in 2024, right? That's and again, we talk about patterns. So you'll see a lot of black men who are disproportionately diagnosed with bipolar disorder instead of anxiety disorder, instead of depression. In the 70s, it was what? It was schizophrenia.
And yeah.
So that so
Right.
Yeah.
if they going in, it's the same thing. Even when we
Yeah.
talk
Yes.
about medications, you know, I had a lot of jobs, you know, because
Yeah.
I can't stay in one place too long. I get claustrophobic. But when I worked at a hospital,
Heard.
um, the the one doctor would always prescribe the same medication
Mm.
over and over again,
Wow.
Yeah.
over and over again. You know what I'm saying? And so, what does this mean? Because if you don't have the language to say, oh, listen, I'm not liking the side effects of this, or you know what, I'm feeling worse because of this,
Right.
then what does that mean? I
Yes.
now, and again, it's you know, there are, you know, quality people out there. So I remember the homie Dr. Pacoda, this queer white man, right, come in flashy and all that.
Hmm.
A good dude. And so I had just started taking Prozac, and I would just be yawning like all day, right?
Mhm.
All day from the Prozac. That was the side effect for me. And I told him, I was like, listen, I just be yawning. He was like, all right. You want to try something else? I'm like, oh, wait, I don't have to. Maybe I shouldn't have said this. It's
Mhm.
cool. Wait, I don't got to go to my primary, because you don't want to go to a primary, honestly, to have conversations about your mental health. You want to go to somebody who specializes in it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so he was like, well, you know, you want to try, how about the 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝗪𝘏? So I 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝗪𝘏. And I was like, yo, I felt like I wanted to beat everybody up. And that was one of the side effects, like increased anger, right? And so, and aggression, like the first few weeks. And I was just like, nah, I can't. I'm Black and married. I can't do that. And so I ended, right? And I ended up with 𝗓𝗋𝑥�er. And so that's worked for me. I've still been taking that, you know, I'm like, hey, I might be taking it for the rest of my life. Hopefully not, but you know, I don't have an issue with that right now. But you're talking about somebody who at that time has 3 degrees, right? Who's worked in the field as a therapist.
Yes.
Who has the language. So what does this mean for the layperson who doesn't?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Ooh. I also hear you talk about, and I have been searching for this word literally the entire time we've been talking, and I still can't get my handle on it, but it's the idea that because someone else, like we are being subject to the white gaze, right? Rather than like other Black people kind of looking at us, there's all this weird like medicalization that comes up, and all of these weird kind of like putting us in buckets that maybe we don't even belong in because they're looking at us through this like semi-racist or just fully racist lens. Especially with the whole like, you know, right now, 2024, Black men are getting bipolar disorder. Like back in 2016, 2015, when I was working in a middle school, all of the kids were getting diagnosed with like ADHD, or like, you know, hyperactive disorders, right? Like, so it's like we also have this kind of side effect of this profession kind of being stacked onto our communities as well, where we're getting overloaded with medications and diagnoses that we don't even need. And instead of actually even talking about or thinking about why or how people are presenting in the ways that they are.
No, listen, you're completely right. And this is where I bring up the name.
Bring it up. Let's hear it.
Listen, because folk can be like, huh? What? And I recognize, right? I preface it by saying, I get all the things. Now, when we talk about the complexity of the individual, I understand it, right? Dr. Umar Johnson.
Oh, God.
Right.
Here we go.
Right.
Here we go. What you got to say?
Let's go.
So I recognize how he presents in the spaces that he finds himself, right? Especially when it's a camera on him, it's such a caricature, right?
Yep.
However, when it comes to the mental health of Black boys and Black men, Black boys specifically, if he said, Phil, come on, we out, I'm rocking right with him. Right, because he is that knowledgeable and speaks exactly to special education within the school system. And this isn't just coming from, you know, the books that I have, you know, that he's written regarding. I'm talking about folk who've actually worked with him in these meetings, these special education meetings. These educators say, yeah, that's some bullshit, whatever he talking about, repeating things 3 times, and you know what I mean, you know, and all of that stuff, right? But when it comes to this special education, when it comes to the mental health of Black boys and disproportionately being diagnosed with ADHD and conduct disorder and what is it? I guess they're, you know, the Ritalin and stuff are Schedule II drugs right up there with your, you know, your cocaines or what have you, these other dreams, these amphetamines, exactly. Like, nah, right? And so I'm a rock with him on that. You know, and so, but again, this is where, you know, you know who the messenger is, and you just got to be mindful of. But when you brought up, you know, working in the middle school, that always comes to mind because he is prolific in that area.
Agree. And we've talked about Dr. Umar many times on the podcast. You know, when he's right, he's right. You can't, you know what I mean? You can't fault him. And he is a fierce advocate for our community. And I do give him respect in that light.
And with that said, I do recommend folk, because I did an episode on this some years ago, but I recommend folk to go watch that Cannon's class, not whatever he got going on now, but Cannon's class, when he was taking classes at another complex brother, when he was taking classes at Howard, and he would have folk on like Dr. Carr, he had Umar on, and it was about 20 minutes straight. where Umar breaks all of this down, breaks it all down. So I encourage folk to definitely check that out. It may not change your perception of them, right? But it's again, we need information ultimately.
Agree. I definitely check that out too. Thank you for sharing. So one of the things, another thing I think might have come from your TED Talk or some of the work that I had a chance to look at was you made the statement that trauma is the biggest influencer of Black mental health, which I think is a really powerful statement.
Yeah.
You know, it was like, wow, I've never heard it quite stated that way, but that rings so true. And we can see it, you know what I mean? Especially for those of us who are living in, you know, cities like Chicago and like Philly. And, you know, I was just
these historical cities where like weird shit has happened to Black people and continues to happen to Black people.
Right. And where
it's
we're
like you feel it
more
in the
and more
soil.
Conscious and aware of like the impact and the importance of our mental health as we look across our cities. So one of the questions that I have just kind of in relation to that statement is, you know, what happens to the trauma that we carry? You know, considering that we understand so much of this is also generational, intergenerational, and how do we go from surviving to thriving?
Yeah. So I mean, it's heavy, right? And so, you know, I'm now, you know, one of the things we talk about is you know, memory, right? Like, and this is where we talk about trauma and how it's reinforcing the reinforcing of stigma, like being in the classroom and learning that, you know, your ancestry started on you know, the 𝘗𝘶𝑻 or something like that. You know what I mean? And so on one of these ships that that housed Africans. Again, even the language, like, you know, I watched the debate just like other folk. And when and I'm not watching it for the buffoonery. I mean, it make me chuckle, you know what I mean? Because 45 he's hilarious.
Hilarious. Right? If nothing else, he's entertaining. If nothing.
Exactly.
The wilderness out there, absolutely.
Okay.
Exactly. But what I'm listening to is I'm listening to language. Like where, like, you know, where are, when you're describing what happened to those Israeli folk or those Jewish folk on October 7th is saying they were slaughtered. And then in the next breath, you're saying Palestinians were killed, right? But for some folk, that might just go over their head. But what I'm listening to is that's the use and power of language, right? One is much more powerful than the other, or even where we put certain things, right? And within a sentence, you know what I'm saying? And so if we're talking about, so, you know, God bless the ancestor, the sister who ran in the Olympics and she was set on fire by
God bless, by her boyfriend.
Her ex-boyfriend
from Uganda, I think.
The way the white supremacist lens is she's the celebrity, she's the known figure, so we're going to put her in the sentence, right? We're going no mention, you might put ex-boyfriend, have no idea what his
ex-boyfriend comes at the end of the sentence.
Right? And so think about when we talk about the language that we use to describe things like sexual violence. There's this other, I think it's another TED Talk where the white guy is talking about how men can end sexual violence, right? And one of the things, this demonstration he puts on and talks about how, you know, he uses rape, like John raped Mary. Mary was raped by John. Mary was raped. At what happens at the end of that? Right? We have no idea. So language is so important when we're talking about this. And I say that in relation to Africans, like they say, yo, you know, I asked my daughter, right? It was like, oh, they, you know, folks were slaves. No. They were Africans who were enslaved.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Right. This isn't their identity, but this is the trauma and how it manifests itself in these different spaces.
And so even how it perpetuates itself. I'm so sorry.
No, you good.
Yeah, but like even how it perpetuates itself. I like in my day job, I study writing, and like teach writing, and like this kind of language thing is is exactly the kind of like undercover sneaky shit, right? In which like white supremacist does its work, right? Especially when we're thinking about who was murdered versus who was slaughtered versus who was killed, right?
Right.
And then I think also we even see that with that case in France right now, with that woman whose husband drugged her, and like she was raped by a lot of his friends, et cetera, right?
Wow.
In which like in all of these stories, we see, even in the videos, we see her, we have her name, we have no idea who he is. We have not like you know his name is not in the article in the news like title, right? Like it
So
was just
important.
like
Yes.
woman raped, right? Woman continuously raped, like those kinds of things. And like we don't, and I think we don't necessarily think about the messaging when things are coming at us, especially when they're formed in a particular way. And so like I'm totally with you. This is also important.
Yeah.
For sure. And so, and just speaking to, you know, back to the question that you asked, when we talk about just the trauma that Black folk carry, specifically Black men, you know, we talk about things like emotional suppression, hyper masculinity. You know, I I stumbled upon it's not, I mean, because you know, I chuckle because it's just interesting, right? I stumbled upon on Twitter. I had no idea what happened to Shannon Sharp, but there's like, yo, Shannon Sharp something, and I was like, oh man.
Have you heard yet, TJ?
No, apparently TJ has yet to hear.
And I don't know if it just happened today or if it happened yesterday. When did it happen?
It was like it. I think it was like yesterday morning, something like that.
Yeah. My daughter just told me about it today.
Lord.
Word. And so Shannon Sharp, he copped to it. He was having sex on Instagram Live accidentally.
Oh, girl.
Right? Accidentally.
Lord.
And so, you know, so according to him, because he has his show that comes on, and him and Chad Johnson, 𝗂𝗄𝘃𝗀, they were talking about it. He said what happened was he came in, you know, they came in, just threw the phone down. You know, IG Live just happened to pop up. You could hear the woman, you know, moaning. You can hear all of this, right? It was probably about, you know, a 10-15 second video, but it made all of the rounds. Now,
of course.
And so I was on YouTube last night. I saw that they were live, him and 𝗂𝗄𝘃𝗀. So I was like, let me tap in. 126,000 people were viewing that show live at that time, right? And when I started, you know, and what he was saying, right? He was like, listen, you know what I mean? It's, you know, it was unprofessional. It was, you know, I try to carry myself in a certain way. And I hear Chad Johnson, you know, it's just like, you know, well, you know, at least we know, you know, you ain't gay now, right? And he said that Cat Williams hit him up and said the same thing, like, well, we know you ain't gay at this point. And when we talk about this hyper masculinity, I have to prove that I'm strong. I have to prove that I'm this virality of that I have. It came across in listening to him explain, right? Instead of it's just like, yeah, you know what, you know, I'm old. You know what I mean? I threw it down. It happens.
Technology does what it does. Yeah,
it happened. You know, you called me Unc for a reason. But it shouldn't be something that's you know, disgusting. And he tried to say it like, yo, billions of people are on this planet. Majority of them came from sexual intercourse. But again, when we talk about white supremacy and patriarchy, how this conversation about sex and, you know, who can do it, who can't do it, and what it's supposed to look like, and how we're supposed to converse about it.
Purity.
Right. Yeah. And even this, you know, nobody really cared about this woman who was, you know, involved in this right now. Granted, her identity is shielded. You don't know who it is, but I'm sure, I wonder what she's feeling. Nobody asked that.
Right.
Nobody asked that. How she's navigating, because she knows it's her. Right. And hearing these conversations and watching people like Terrell Owens come out and say, I know that voice. And it's just like, and again, when we talk about this hyper masculinity, I have to prove I'm a man, the machismo that exists in this patriarchal society. And then also we talk about just a mistrust of institutions, right? It's, you know, it's the reason why Black men don't go to the doctors, right? It's deeper than Tuskegee, which even though that played an integral part, you know, in how we show up, is going in there. And you know, having to, you know, when I go to the doctor, right, it's things like, do you want to get weighed? Right. This is the nurse. And I was just like, because I know you could say no. Again, this is me. I've been in this field for a very long time. I know you could say no to the professional, but ultimately we're taught to trust the professional.
That's right.
And think about that, especially when we talk about Black folk. I would go into these educational meetings with the dopest sisters, right, who are there for their kids, and they be in there and they're super passive, they're quiet, but then when they get out, they have everything to say because we're taught to trust the professional. And so I'm in there and she's like, you want to get weighed? I said, no, the time before, because then I just like, F it, I'm not doing that. I got on there and it was like 240, right? And she was like, oh, you're big. Oh, okay. You know, you don't know how I'm gonna take that.
Like, it's just
you know what
like,
I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then it was just like, you got to be mindful of your weight and all, you know, the BMI, and which is again
racist.
That's their ish.
All the way.
All the way.
And so, but then she took my heart rate and she was just like, wow, it's so low. And she was like, you know, took my blood pressure, like, wow, it's low at a resting. She's like, are you an athlete or so? I'm like, yeah, you know, I lift weights. I recognize in the, you know, what stress is, right? Positive stress. So I'm increasing my stress level. So, you know, when I'm resting, it'll be even lower. Right. But then it's that idea that we don't know. Right. And so we get in there and that's perpetuated. So it's just like, what's the point of me going in there? If you know, if I'm not going to be believed, if I'm not going to be trusted,
right.
We got a whole epidemic of opioid use coming because one specific set of group was trusted all the time when they went in these places.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Exactly.
But
and
Black folk, it's just like, yo, listen, take this Tylenol 800. You know, you're malingering, right? The pain ain't as bad as you say it is. Right. And so again, this is that we talk about the mistrust. And then just going when we look at, you know, what happens like generationally, right? We talk about like epigenetics and just how that trauma is processed and how that impacts how we navigate things like stress and trauma and so forth. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, it rolls deep. I forgot the last part of the question. My bad.
I also like have so you were talking about Shannon Sharpe, right? And how that the person was like, well, at least we know you're not gay. Right. Okay. So I want to like stand there, of course. And I think that was one of the things that really bothered me, among others, about the Diddy conversation, right? Is that the focus was like, Diddy's on the low, Diddy's gay, Diddy was propositioning all these dudes, and not Diddy raped all these people, like Diddy did all of this shit, like all of those kinds of things, and like and the harm that he did to Black women in particular, right? And like, and it seemed like his biggest crime was being on the low rather than the harm.
As it should, right? Like if we recognize the systems that we operate under, the worst thing you can ever call a Black man is call him gay. That's the worst thing that you could do. Right. That's worse than talking about somebody's mother. You know what I mean? You call somebody gay. Listen, those are fighting words, right? And so, because again, when we talk about patriarchy, white supremacy, the Judeo-Christian, you know, how all of that influences how so many of us show up today. Yeah, it makes complete sense that was said. You know, at some point I'm gonna write this article about Paul's culture. So pause is if I'm like, and leave this in, and definitely leave this in. If I'm like,
we will.
And then but think about it, like I'm the comfort of me even, you see, I done talk about all this stuff. And it gets here and I'm about to say a statement. And it's just like, well, if this is played, I wonder how people are going to take it. Right. But if I'm like, yo, I couldn't take it. It was too big. You know what I mean? I could be talking about a shot at the doctor.
Yes,
right? I could be
you
talking
could be talking about stress, a project. You could be talking about a plate.
Any and everything.
Anything. But I better say pause. Right, because it's just like, oh, timeout, no homo, flag on the play, just to let y'all know.
We love no homo culture.
you know what I mean? That's not what I'm doing. So I was listening to Sports Talk Radio today, and it's just like, hey, you got to say pause to everything. But then when you start to listen to these different platforms, and just even in conversation, right? You know, people who I rock with, you know, even myself, I'm not gonna act like I'm holier than thou, right? You know, as I might throw like a pause, you know what I mean? Like, oh, relax. You know what I'm saying? It's meant in jest, but then when you start to unpack it, right? And this is where I say, you know, the complexity of an individual and what's the responsibility of community when it comes to things like folk can say, oh, Phil, like, you know, you talk so much about Black mental health. You know, we love that. You know what I mean? But if I'm out here, if I'm saying pause, which means like, oh, I'm not saying that I'm gay. Well, what does this say about folk who are queer?
Who are gay?
Right? What am I saying subconsciously?
Yeah.
We need to be challenging and questioning all of that. And that's why I use the language. Like, I don't say like I'm an ally. Like, yeah, you know, I got trans homies who I'm cool with and queer homies who I'm cool with. I say I'm a probationary ally, right? Because I'm one pause away from being right back on that other side. You know what I'm saying? And so that keeps me honest. Again, we're all fallible, we're all human. But if some, and I say this, if somebody see me saying pause or laughing at it or something like that, like, oh, what's up with that? Because we need to be checking one another. And this is where we talk about community. But and outside of this rugged individualism and what you do is what you do is, nah, we need to be checking one another if we truly care about community.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because I think that was the thing. That's like the thing about no homo discourse, or like the pause, right? Is that even acknowledging the pause or even saying no homo immediately says that there is shame in being queer, right? And that like, and that there's something like taboo about it, that there's something unusual, not normal about it, and it continues to like add on to the stigma, right? And then it's like the other thing is like we don't even know who's in the room. Right. And then like the way that affects other people.
And that's, and again, and we, especially, and that's prevalent you know, within, that's why I'm super critical of hip hop culture. And so it's something that, again, I'm actively participating. When we talk about just the culture, it impacts how I show up on a day-to-day basis. But we have to discuss the unhealthy things that are associated with it. And that's definitely one of them.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is, what is this saying? But the thing is, who's going to be the person to step out and take the hit for it? You know what I'm saying? Who's going to step out? Who, you know, I have my platform and I say what I need to say on my platform. You know, it's big and it'll reach the people it's supposed to reach, right? But who's on a bigger stage? Who on the radio going to be like, or a caller going to call and say, yo, what? You know, when you do this, this happens. And this is where this idea of teaching one another, because no sister going to be able to tell a brother. Yeah, she may be able to tell him, right? And be like, listen, but it's going to be the other brothers who going to really have to hold him accountable. And then again, looking at it from a communal perspective, like community has to hold one another accountable when it comes to all of this that we're discussing.
Fully agree. And I think that's why what you said was so powerful about being a probationary ally, because it absolutely has to start with us too, right? And being honest about the fact that a lot of this stuff is also internalized. Like we can have marginalized identities and still speak in harmful ways about ourselves and about our communities too. None of us are exempt. And so it is important that we bring it back to understanding that, you know, liberation is not one way. Until all of us are free, none of us are free. And that is the importance of community.
For sure.
And listening to each other, because it's going to be community that helps us like triangulate where we're wrong and how to get back together.
Yeah, agreed.